this lecture, you're going to understand how we can implement subnetting. Now, I'm actually going to cover subnetting over a few lectures in this section. Subnetting is a really important topic, not just for passing the CCNA exam, but for networking in general. It's really one of the core knowledge areas that you need to understand if you're going to work in networking. So if you need it, take a quick break before you watch this lecture, then get yourself a cup of coffee and come back, and we're going to dive deep into networking. Okay, to understand this lecture, you need to think about it from the context of the originally intended IPv4 design, just like we did in the previous few lectures there, where all hosts which can communicate on the internet have a public IP address. Now, if you're already working in a company where you've already got exposure to working on the network, the chances are that your company is going to be using private IP addresses. Now, as we go through these lectures, do not think about it from that point of view. Okay, we're going to get into private IP addresses later, and I'll also explain how modern day networks work. But before we get there, you need to understand how IPv4 worked in the first place. It's a natural progression. Understand this first, and then you'll be able to understand why we use private addresses on our networks and how they work as well. Okay, so just bear with me and think about it from the point of view of how the internet worked like 10 or 15 years ago, before we were running out of addresses and before everybody was using private addresses. Oh, while I say that, by the way, the majority of companies are using private addresses, but there are a few out there that are using public addresses everywhere. That is pretty rare though. Okay, so for our example, let's say that we're a network designer for a small business with 4 departments that are spread over 2 offices, and we want to manage our own public address space. So what we could do is we could buy 4 separate Class C networks for that. But the problem is that public IP addresses cost money. So rather than doing that, rather than buying separate networks from the Internet Authorities, we could purchase a single range and subnet it into smaller portions. Like, let's say we've only got a handful of hosts in each of those departments. Rather than buying 256 addresses for each, we can buy a single Class C range, and then we can divide that network up into smaller networks or separate Class C networks for that. But the problem is that public IP addresses cost money. So rather than doing that, rather than buying manage our own public address space. So what we could do is we could buy 4 separate Class C networks for that. But the problem is that public IP addresses cost money. So rather than doing that, rather than buying separate networks from the Internet Authorities, we could purchase a single range and subnet it into smaller portions. Like, let's say we've only got a handful of hosts in each of those departments, rather than buying 256 addresses for each, we can buy a single Class C range, and then we can divide that network up into smaller networks and assign it to the different parts of our networks. So in the example, let's say we've got that Class C range, and it is 200.15.10.0/24, the default Class C subnet masks. So to do our subnetting, to divide that network into smaller subnets, we need to borrow some host bits and add them to the network portion of the address. So we're going to move the line that separates the network portion of the address and the host portion further over to the right. So we're going to
you